Mark "Slick" Thompson, Liam "the Ghost" O'Connor, and Darren "Red" Hughes weren't just criminals. They were legends in Liverpool's underworld. From the back streets of Toxteth to the sun-soaked villas of Marbella, their names struck fear across continents. But how did three young men from one of England's toughest neighborhoods rise to become kingpins of an international cocaine empire, leaving a trail of violence, betrayal, and untold fortune in their wake? In the heart of Liverpool during the 1970s, the streets of Toxteth were a place of poverty, tension, and survival. Families struggled in the shadow of unemployment and crumbling housing estates, while young men roamed the back streets searching for ways to escape their circumstances. Out of this environment, a new breed of criminal began to emerge, men who saw opportunity not in hard work but in fast money. Petty theft was the starting point, with stolen radios, bicycles, and handbags feeding their pockets. Yet the hunger for more quickly pushed them into bolder crimes. Small burglaries turned into shop raids, and before long, a generation of armed robbers was being born. The docks, once Liverpool's beating heart, provided these men with more than just a backdrop. They were gateways to the outside world, where smuggled goods flowed as easily as the tides. While legitimate trade struggled, the underworld flourished. Armed crews found ways to exploit weak security and underpaid dockworkers, who were often tempted to turn a blind eye for a cut of the profits. What began as opportunistic snatches of contraband soon transformed into highly organized operations. These were not just petty crooks anymore. They were becoming the first faces of Liverpool's organized crime. The robberies grew more daring. Post offices became easy targets, with armed men storming through the doors, shouting orders and fleeing with bags of cash. Armored vans carrying payrolls were ambushed on quiet roads, their drivers left terrified as masked men wielding shotguns forced them to hand over the money. Betting shops, already filled with cash, became another frequent target. These jobs were quick, violent, and profitable, and they built reputations for the men who dared to pull them off. Word of successful raids spread fast across Toxteth and beyond, inspiring others to join the light. These men were not simply chasing money. They were chasing respect in a city that often gave them none. In the pubs and clubs of Liverpool, their names carried weight. They were feared by rivals, admired by some locals, and quietly watched by the police, who struggled to keep up with their sudden rise. Every successful heist gave them more power, and with that power came loyalty from their communities. For many, they were seen as rebels against a system that had abandoned them, though their violence left scars on both victims and bystanders. But beneath the glamour of fast cars and bundles of stolen cash lay seeds of destruction. Rival crews began to form, each hungry for the same reputation and spoils. Fights over territory and loot turned violent, and grudges quickly spiraled into blood feuds. The once simple business of robbery became a brutal struggle for dominance. Police forces, initially overwhelmed, began to adapt. Special units were formed to track the robbers, and undercover operations crept into the very pubs and clubs where plans were being made. The legacy of Toxteth's armed robbers was already cementing itself by the end of the decade. They had turned a small corner of Liverpool into a breeding ground for organized gangs, rewriting the city's criminal history. What had started as survival on the streets was evolving into something larger, darker, and far more dangerous, an empire of crime that would soon stretch far beyond Liverpool's boundaries. By the time the 1980s arrived, Liverpool's underworld had moved into a new era. The young men who once snatched purses and raided corner shops had now become seasoned criminals, hardened by years of daring escapes and violent confrontations. Their robberies were no longer reckless gambles, but carefully planned operations that carried the precision of military strikes. Crews of men gathered intelligence on targets, studied security routines, and timed their attacks down to the minute. Their ambition had grown, and so had the stakes. No longer satisfied with a few £100 from a betting shop, they now went after armored vans, warehouses filled with valuable goods, and payroll deliveries meant to fund entire companies. These were not small-time thefts. These were heists that shook the city. The scale of the robberies drew attention across Britain. Liverpool gangs were becoming infamous, feared by security companies, and whispered about by other criminals who admired their ruthlessness. Their attacks were swift and brutal. Masked men carrying shotguns and iron bars descended on vehicles in quiet streets, forcing guards to the ground and escaping with bags of money. Warehouses were stormed with sledgehammers and crowbars, stolen goods disappearing into the night within minutes. The level of organization stunned law enforcement. Police officers used to dealing with drunken fights or burglaries suddenly found themselves facing heavily armed crews who thought nothing of shooting their way to freedom. In many ways, these gangs were ahead of their time. They invested in stolen cars, forged documents, and safe houses across the city. Some even kept informants inside security companies, feeding them details of routes and schedules. Others used intimidation to silence witnesses or frighten rivals into submission. For them, crime was not just survival anymore, it was business. Each successful raid meant more money to fund the next job, more weapons to intimidate rivals, and more influence in the streets. Their lifestyles reflected their gains. Flashy cars, expensive clothes, and wild nights out became trademarks of the men who were quickly turning into legends of the Liverpool underworld. But their growing success came with consequences. Rival gangs were watching closely, and jealousy turned to violence. Territory disputes erupted, with ambushes and shootouts shaking the backstreets of Toxteth, Everton, and Kirkdale. A city already struggling with poverty and riots found itself consumed by a war between men who would stop at nothing to protect their profits. Ordinary families lived in fear of being caught in the crossfire, while police faced mounting pressure to act. Law enforcement responded with new tactics. Specialist armed response units were formed, and intelligence networks were expanded to track the movements of known criminals. Surveillance vans parked outside pubs, phones were tapped, and raids were launched in dawn operations that dragged entire crews into custody. Yet even as police celebrated victories, another crew would rise to fill the gap. The 1980s cemented Liverpool's reputation as a city of fearless robbers, men willing to risk everything for wealth and power. Their daring crimes captured headlines, but behind the headlines lay a deeper truth. The robberies were no longer just about money, they were about building reputations, claiming territory, and planting the roots of something even more dangerous. The groundwork was being laid for a transformation that would take these men from robbers of cash to traffickers of something far more profitable. Something that would change Liverpool's criminal world forever. The late 1980s marked a turning point in Liverpool's criminal landscape, a shift that would change the city forever. For years, armed robberies had defined the gangs, but the winds were changing. Across the Atlantic, Colombian cartels were expanding their reach, looking for new entry points into Europe. Liverpool, with its vast docks and shipping routes, offered the perfect gateway. Containers arrived daily from South America, packed with fruit, textiles, or machinery. Hidden deep inside some of them, concealed within crates and packages, were bricks of cocaine. At first, the quantities were small, smuggled in by opportunists who knew dock workers willing to take a risk for extra cash. But the profits were so enormous that soon the trickle became a flood. For the Liverpool gangs, this new trade was irresistible. Robberies carried high risks, armed confrontations, heavy prison sentences, and violent feuds with rivals. Cocaine, on the other hand, promised untold riches with less immediate danger. A single shipment could bring in millions, dwarfing anything a payroll van could offer. The Toxteth robbers, who had once thrived on fast, brutal jobs, began to redirect their energy. Old smuggling routes, once used for stolen goods, were now repurposed for drugs. They still used their networks of safe houses, trusted drivers, and corrupt insiders, but now the rewards were 10 times higher. As cocaine spread through Liverpool, the city's nightlife changed almost overnight. Clubs filled with young people high on the drug, dealers openly sold in pubs and bars, and a culture of excess began to dominate. The underworld grew richer, and its bosses more powerful. Cocaine was not just a substance, it became a currency of influence. With money flowing faster than ever before, the gangs began to resemble cartels. They bought properties, invested in legitimate businesses, and recruited a new generation of enforcers. Violence did not disappear, it evolved. Disputes over robberies had been bloody, but now arguments over drug shipments and territory escalated into executions. Guns became more common, imported alongside drugs, and the sound of gunfire echoed through Liverpool's estate. The city itself bore the scars. Addiction tore through working-class communities, fueling crime as addicts turned to theft and burglary to feed their habits. Families that had once seen the gangs as rebellious folk heroes now lived in fear of them. The money being made was staggering, but so were the costs to ordinary lives. Police, already stretched from tackling robberies, now faced a drug epidemic unlike anything they had seen before. The scale of the problem made it almost impossible to contain. Behind the scenes, alliances with international suppliers grew stronger. Some Liverpool figures traveled abroad, meeting Colombian and Dutch contacts, striking deals that would solidify their power for decades. The men who had once robbed post offices were now international traffickers, speaking the language of cartels and laundering millions through offshore accounts. The city's underworld had been reshaped. Cocaine was no longer a sideline, it was the main business. And as the profits grew, so did the violence, drawing Liverpool into a darker, deadlier chapter of its criminal history. By the 1990s, the criminal world of Liverpool had transformed into something resembling the structure of a traditional mafia. What had once been loose groups of robbers and opportunistic dealers now hardened into organized families with strict hierarchies, codes of loyalty, and a reputation for brutality. The city's underworld no longer revolved around smash-and-grab jobs or chaotic robberies. It was carefully managed, controlled through layers of secrecy and intimidation. At the top sat men who rarely showed their faces in public. They avoided the spotlight, hiding behind legitimate businesses like nightclubs, taxi firms, scrapyards, and private security companies. These fronts made it nearly impossible to trace their wealth and gave them the appearance of legitimate success. Behind the curtains, however, they ruled through fear. The structure was simple but effective. At the top were the bosses, men who never touched drugs directly, but who negotiated the shipments, brokered international deals, and demanded a cut from everything that passed through the city. Beneath them were trusted lieutenants, responsible for enforcing discipline, managing territories, and dealing with the flow of drugs. At the street level, younger gangs acted as soldiers, pushing cocaine and heroin into pubs, clubs, and housing estates. Each layer protected the one above it, making it difficult for police to link the drugs in someone's pocket to the men in luxury homes outside the city. Violence was the glue that kept this structure in place. Anyone who crossed the families, whether a rival dealer, a suspected informant, or even a business partner who failed to pay, faced terrifying consequences. Kidnappings became a weapon of control, with victims beaten or tortured until they agreed to cooperate. Drive-by shootings, once rare in Britain, became part of the landscape in Liverpool. Homes were firebombed, cars sprayed with bullets, and gangland executions became almost routine. Fear silenced witnesses, and entire communities learned not to speak to the police. What made this era even more dangerous was the introduction of high-powered weapons. Guns, smuggled alongside drug shipments, found their way into the hands of young men eager to prove themselves. A dispute that might once have ended with fists now ended with bullets. The escalation was relentless, and it gave Liverpool one of the highest rates of gun crime in the country during the decade. Even innocent people were sometimes caught in the crossfire, sparking outrage in the media but little change on the ground. For the bosses, business thrived. They enjoyed the rewards of their empire, lavish villas in Spain, holidays in Dubai, and expensive cars on the streets of Liverpool. Yet their public personas remained carefully managed. Many were seen as respectable businessmen, sponsoring local events or investing in properties. Their power was not just physical, it was psychological. Ordinary people whispered their names with both fear and awe, knowing that to cross them was to invite disaster. The transformation of Liverpool's gangs into cartel-style organizations set the stage for a new era of criminal dominance. The old days of quick robberies were gone. What replaced them was more sophisticated, more violent, and far more profitable. The city was now firmly in the grip of men who thought and acted like international kingpins, and they had no intention of giving up their control. By the mid-1990s and into the early 2000s, Liverpool's crime bosses had grown too big to be confined within their own city. The money pouring in from cocaine trafficking demanded new ways to spend, move, and protect it. Local operations, no matter how profitable, were no longer enough. The gangs began to look outward, expanding their reach across borders and turning themselves into truly international players. Spain's Costa del Sol was one of the first destinations. With its sunshine, luxury villas, and booming nightlife, it became a safe haven for British criminals. Liverpool voices could be heard in Marbella's expensive bars and beach clubs, as men who once stalked the streets of Toxteth now strolled through marinas filled with yachts. From Spain they coordinated shipments arriving into European ports, using the country's position as a gateway to smuggle drugs across the continent. Vast amounts of cocaine came through hidden in fruit containers or stashed deep within cargo ships, and the Liverpool bosses made sure they had trusted men ready to move the shipments onward. Amsterdam also became a key hub. The city's reputation for tolerance and its well-established smuggling routes made it a natural base for deals with Dutch wholesalers. Liverpool gangs built connections with Moroccan hashish suppliers, South American cartel representatives, and Eastern European fixers. Each relationship strengthened their power and ensured a steady pipeline of narcotics flowing back into Britain. Money laundering became just as important as the drug trade itself. Huge profits could not simply be spent without raising suspicion, so elaborate systems were put in place. Fake companies, offshore bank accounts, and investments in property developments allowed them to disguise criminal money as legitimate earnings. Some bosses even purchased hotels, nightclubs, and car dealerships, all of which provided cover for moving dirty cash through clean channels. Dubai began to attract them too, with its luxury lifestyle and lax financial oversight. There they could flaunt their wealth more openly, blending in among businessmen and tourists, while still keeping their criminal networks intact back home. For the men in charge, this international expansion gave them both power and protection. Operating abroad made it harder for British police to reach them, and they could direct operations from a distance while enjoying a life of luxury. Yet their presence overseas also brought attention. Rival British gangs, particularly those from London and Manchester, were also establishing themselves in Spain, leading to tensions and sometimes violent confrontations in Marbella's streets and nightclubs. The competition for control of smuggling routes spilled into brutal clashes, proving that even in the sun-soaked resorts of the Mediterranean, the rules of Liverpool's underworld still applied. Back in Liverpool, their influence was felt more than ever. Younger dealers idolized the bosses living abroad, dreaming of one day joining them in Spain or Dubai. Communities remained trapped under the weight of drugs and violence, while families back home were torn apart by addiction. What began in the back streets of Toxteth had now grown into an empire that spanned continents. The men who once robbed post offices were now international traffickers, shaping the flow of drugs across Europe and beyond. Liverpool's criminal world had gone global, and it was clear that the stakes were higher than ever before. With power and wealth came paranoia, and by the early 2000s, Liverpool's criminal elite had become trapped in a cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. Trust, once a rare but valuable commodity, had become almost impossible to maintain. Lieutenants who had faithfully served bosses for years began cutting secret deals with rival gangs or law enforcement, hoping to protect themselves or claim a piece of the empire. Friends became enemies overnight, and alliances that had lasted decades dissolved in a matter of days. The underworld was no longer just about profits, it was about survival, and betrayal was the currency of those who wanted to climb higher. Executions became a common tool to enforce loyalty. Men who were suspected of leaking information or stealing from the operation were eliminated with terrifying efficiency. Some were shot on quiet streets, others in their homes, and still others abroad in places thought to be safe havens. Messages were left deliberately for others to see: a headless mannequin in a nightclub doorway, a body discovered in a river, or a car abandoned with its doors locked and the engine running. Each act of violence served both as punishment and as a warning, reinforcing the idea that crossing a Liverpool boss was a death sentence. Informants, both willing and coerced, had become an integral part of the city's criminal landscape. Some provided intelligence to police for protection or reward, while others were motivated by revenge. These leaks led to spectacular raids, arrests, and the dismantling of entire networks. Yet even as authorities struck significant blows, the vacuum created by captured or killed bosses allowed new figures to rise. Ambitious young criminals, inspired by tales of wealth and power, were quick to seize opportunities, often continuing the cycle of violence in even more brutal ways. The atmosphere within the city was tense. Ordinary citizens, who had once seen the gangs as remote figures, now felt the fear personally. Streets that had once been familiar became dangerous zones where drive-by shootings, kidnappings, and public assaults could erupt without warning. Communities that had tolerated or even admired the early generations of Toxteth robbers now recoiled at the ruthless methods of their successors. Life in Liverpool had changed. It was no longer just about survival in a poor neighborhood. It was about navigating a city where the underworld dictated the rules. Even the families of gang members were not spared. Wives, siblings, and children often became targets in retaliation campaigns, whether for revenge or to send a message. Homes were firebombed, businesses vandalized, and those associated with the wrong person could find themselves in immediate danger. The psychological impact was immense, and fear became woven into the fabric of daily life. Despite the chaos, the bosses themselves remained calculating. They used violence strategically, ensuring it served their interests rather than just expressing anger. They kept networks of loyal enforcers, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Their wealth allowed them to evade capture, travel internationally, and maintain influence even when hiding in plain sight. Yet the constant threat of betrayal meant that no one could ever fully relax. This era of betrayal and bloodshed defined the Liverpool underworld. It was a time when empires rose and fell almost overnight, where loyalty was fleeting and the cost of power was measured in lives. The city had evolved from a place of petty crime to a battlefield for international traffickers, where every decision carried consequences and every alliance could become a death trap. The legacy of fear and violence was solidified, shaping Liverpool's criminal world for decades to come. By the mid-2000s, it became clear that Liverpool's underworld, despite its wealth and brutality, could no longer operate without interference. The scale of international cocaine trafficking, the public acts of violence, and the growing fear among ordinary citizens had forced law enforcement to adapt. British police, long frustrated by the elusive nature of gang leaders, began coordinating with European counterparts in Spain, the Netherlands, and beyond. Joint task forces were established, combining intelligence from multiple countries to target the city's criminal elite. The sophisticated surveillance and investigation techniques marked a turning point in the fight against Liverpool's crime networks. Undercover operations became central to dismantling the gangs. Officers infiltrated nightclubs, taxi companies, and warehouses, posing as employees or business associates. Phones were tapped, bank accounts monitored, and communications intercepted. For the first time, law enforcement had eyes and ears inside operations that had previously seemed untouchable. Detailed records of shipments, payments, and meetings exposed the inner workings of a criminal empire that had grown so vast it spanned continents. The information collected provided the evidence necessary to arrest bosses who had long thought themselves beyond reach. Raids were executed with precision. At dawn, police stormed luxury homes in Liverpool and Spain, confiscating weapons, drugs, and millions in cash. Vehicles used for smuggling were seized, and high-end properties serving as money laundering fronts were frozen. Arrests of high-ranking figures sent shock waves through the city's underworld, shaking the very foundations of the mafia-style structure that had dominated Liverpool for decades. Yet, for every kingpin removed, a new figure emerged, eager to fill the vacuum left behind. The cycle of power and violence continued, though now under the pressure of law enforcement scrutiny. The impact of these operations was both immediate and long-term. Smaller gangs, once protected by the fear inspired by powerful leaders, struggled to maintain control. Territorial disputes escalated as competitors tried to take advantage of the shifting landscape. Many minor figures were either arrested, killed, or forced into hiding. Meanwhile, the community began to see glimpses of relief as police presence increased and the most dangerous criminals were removed from the streets. Still, the influence of international networks meant that the reach of Liverpool's gangs could never be fully eradicated. Public attention to these raids also grew. Media outlets covered the arrests extensively, broadcasting images of seized drugs, guns, and cash. The public learned about the scale of operations, the international connections, and the sheer wealth accumulated by men who had started as street robbers in Toxteth. This exposure, while humiliating to the criminals, also served to warn others that law enforcement was now capable of striking at the highest levels. Despite these successes, the city's criminal world proved resilient. The structure of organized crime adapted, using encrypted communications, new smuggling routes, and trusted intermediaries to continue operations. For every operation that dismantled a network, another emerged with new methods and strategies. The struggle between law enforcement and Liverpool's gangs had become a high-stakes game, with both sides constantly evolving. By the end of this period, it was clear that the police had made significant inroads, but the underworld's influence remained. The arrests and seizures had weakened the old guard. Yet the legacy of fear, power, and international connections persisted. Liverpool's criminal empire had been hit, but it had not been destroyed. The city, still haunted by its past, was a reminder that even the most sophisticated law enforcement efforts faced limits against a deeply entrenched network of crime. Even after years of police crackdowns and high-profile arrests, Liverpool's criminal underworld continued to cast a long shadow over the city. The legacy of the Toxteth robbers, the cocaine traffickers, and the international kingpins was never fully erased. While the old mafia-style families had been weakened, new gangs had emerged to take their place, adapting to modern methods and exploiting new opportunities. County lines operations, once unheard of, now allowed Liverpool-based groups to control the flow of drugs into smaller towns and rural areas, spreading their influence far beyond the city limits. Young men, drawn by the promise of quick money and status, became the new soldiers in a network that had been shaped by decades of violence and ambition. The streets of Liverpool remained tense. Drive-by shootings, street stabbings, and attacks on rival gang members continued to erupt, leaving communities living in fear. Innocent bystanders were often caught in the crossfire, and the psychological impact on neighborhoods was profound. Families who had once tolerated or even admired the older generation of gangsters now found themselves terrified by the next wave of violence. Schools, parks, and shopping areas were no longer entirely safe, as gang activity infiltrated every corner of daily life. Despite efforts to reduce crime, the city's reputation as a hub for organized criminal activity persisted. Meanwhile, the international connections established by the older generation of Liverpool crime bosses remained a formidable force. Spain, the Netherlands, and even countries in the Middle East continued to serve as safe havens for those involved in the drug trade. While some kingpins were imprisoned, others managed to evade capture, maintaining influence from abroad. Money laundering networks and shell companies allowed criminal profits to circulate freely, keeping the city's gangs well-funded and capable of sustaining their operation. The combination of local violence and international connections created a criminal ecosystem that was difficult for authorities to fully dismantle. The culture of fear and power had also become ingrained in the minds of young people. Stories of flashy villas in Spain, expensive cars, and rapid wealth inspired a new generation to seek similar paths. Social media and online platforms provided new ways to advertise status and intimidate rivals, expanding the reach of gang influence into previously untouched areas. Modern gangs were smarter, faster, and more connected than ever before, using technology alongside traditional methods of violence to maintain control. Yet despite the persistence of crime, there were signs of hope. Community groups, outreach programs, and targeted policing began to make a difference in some areas, helping young people find alternatives to gang life. Schools and youth organizations worked to break the cycle of poverty and violence, attempting to redirect ambition toward legal and productive endeavors. The challenge, however, remained immense. Liverpool's underworld was deeply embedded, and every success in law enforcement or social intervention was met with the resilience and adaptability of the gangs themselves. Liverpool's Mafia legacy is a story of ambition, violence, and survival, stretching from the back streets of Toxteth to the luxurious villas of the Costa del Sol. It is a story of men who rose from poverty to power, leaving behind a trail of blood and fear. The city still carries the weight of this history, a reminder that crime empires may fall, but their influence endures. The streets, the ports, and the communities continue to feel the effects of decades of organized crime, proving that Liverpool's underworld is not just a chapter of the past, it is an ongoing saga that continues to shape the city today.